Athletes, brought to you by Prepare Like a Pro. My name is Jack McLean. I'm your host, and today I'm lucky enough to have Georgia Bevan, who's the performance dietitian at the Adelaide Crows. Our key topic for today's chat will be talking about empowering athletes to fuel for performance without obsession and a restrictive process with that. So if you're an athlete listening in, make sure to get your training diary out. If you're listening in live, feel free to send through some questions. And of course, performance staff as well. No doubt you'll get some gems here. But welcome, Georgia. Thanks for jumping on. Really looking forward to our chat.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it as well.
For those that aren't aware of your background, no doubt there'll be a lot of performance staff and athletes that are tuning in. But for those that aren't aware, Georgia, do you mind providing a bit of a background, I guess, how you started in the industry as a performance dietitian and different sort of work experiences you've had along the way, as well as, of course, your playing career as well?
Yeah. So probably a little bit different maybe than some of the other people we've had on, because my start of my career tend to be at the same time as my AFLW career as well. So I guess like how I got into dietetics, it felt like a bit of an accident. In uni, I sort of just put the highest ATAR first and hope for the best, and managed to get into that sort of bachelor program. And then from there was just sort of developing, an interest in the sport world. I was playing softball and football, and at like a state level, and then managed to get in sort of that wave of AFLW at the same time. So my first year out into the real world in corporate health was my first job. And that was a fantastic starting point, because it gave me a really well-rounded insight into, sleep and stress management. And it was sort of like performance, but for corporate people. So it was really great to kind of increase my scope of practice that way. And then that was also when I got drafted to the Crows as well. So played for them for a couple of years and in the inaugural AFLW Premiership. And then sort of part of that process of being an athlete and then working was trying to find work that was really flexible and let you, there was points where I had to fly back and forth to Melbourne because I was playing in the VFLW for Hawthorn. And at one point I moved my life up to the Gold Coast for 4 months as an injury replacement up there with the Suns. So I had a lot of different workplaces, more like casual work at clinical hospitals that were really supportive of me coming back and forth, and then private practice. So all along that time, just building some connections with sporting clubs, running presentations, and then hopefully getting those referrals into athletes into private practice as well. And then sort of as my AFLW career was wrapping up, the opportunity at the Crows popped up. Stars sort of aligned, so one door closed officially, but another one opened, which is it's been fantastic, and it's been great to still be involved in the sport. I was still playing up until midway through last year, and then hung up the boots with Sample W. It's just a little bit too tricky to do both, work in sport and give all your energies to both of them. And then recently started with the Thunderbirds as well. So it's been a crazy, roughly about seven or 8 years. There's been a lot that's been happening, but it's been a whirlwind that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, some great experiences there, and no doubt that the playing experience will give you good empathy with the athletes that you're currently working with. Do you find that like the performance dietitian role was what you expected it to be, I guess, when you think back to your mindset when you decided to study it? For those listening that might be interested, and perhaps they're in high school and they're interested in nutrition and fueling for performance, but they're not sure where they want to go. What was something that, why did you decide to study it, and then has that sort of lived up to its expectation?
Yeah, I think I find a lot of health professionals have sort of like maybe a lived experience with something that's increased like interest in the area. So for me, I was obviously playing a lot of sport growing up, and also interested in food, and grew up in the household with lots of health professionals. So it was sort of like a natural progression to choose something like that. Throughout my career, I didn't really know what I wanted to do in uni. I had that sports interest, and I didn't really know what a dietitian even did, but there's so many opportunities out there. And I think if you have that area that is a niche, that's sort of what separates you, because there's so many people that would have like a very general interest area, and that's fine. But I find as you go along, if you can specialize and find what makes you different. So for me, it was I've been an athlete. I know that experience, and I knew the benefits of fueling performance. I found in my teenage years, I had that restrictive mindset. I was always on diets, and I felt like that really held me back from like my peak performance. And so, being able to then go into a job where I can stop that happening again for an athlete was what really motivated me. So, I think if you sometimes going in what you want to do, but sometimes you just find it along the way. I really loved all my experiences in the different jobs that I have. They were great for different reasons, but I think with sport, it's definitely not maybe not what you see from the outside, because it is pretty grueling at times. There's long days. You're traveling a lot, especially if you're not a non-Victorian team, and there's also that element of there's really strong relationships that you have to build. So I think that was probably what I didn't expect going in, was how important it was to really build those relationships from the ground. And especially with male athletes, they tend to not trust you straight away. You have to sort of get in with the boys, and that took a little bit of time. But I've gotten a lot of reward from getting to know them and making that a priority just as much as getting the education in.
Yeah, well said. And looking back over your journey, who have been some strong influences or mentors, if you like, that have helped shape your philosophy?
Yeah, so I've had quite a few, obviously, with lots of different workplaces. But early days, Olivia Warnes was a fantastic mentor for me. She actually worked at the Crows back in the day as well, and now works at Sassy, heads up their cycling program and a lot of their athletes there. And she was great, just opening my eyes to the sporting world and early feet on the ground kind of work in dietetics. And then Bree Salagaris, who was in the Crows role as well, who moved up to Queensland. So she, once I was in the AFLW program, she was my dietitian. And then I started working with her in private practice as well. So she gave me some really great insights into elite sport whilst I was still sort of learning all those things. So she was fantastic for that. And I guess in sport, you also cross paths with physios and doctors and all sorts of people. But Brett Spinem was my first like real boss in the real world in corporate health. So I couldn't have asked for a better first boss. He was fantastic he loved sport. So we could just bro down on sport in our spare time or over coffee. But he also really challenged me to push myself with my leadership and my communication style. So I think he really set me up for success in those early days.
And what about highlights, both in playing as well as your professional as a performance dietitian career so far? What are sort of some moments that you look back on fondly that you're proud of?
I think playing wise, obviously can't go past an inaugural AFLW premiership. I still think it's one of those situations and moments in time that when I'm in a rocking chair at 80, I'm going to look back and just think, wow, I can't believe I was a part of that. It still feels a little bit surreal at the moment. So obviously that. And then from a career perspective, in those early days of corporate health in SA, there were quite a few companies and big corporations that were sort of closing down their manufacturing. So we were involved in supporting those staff members from transitioning out of their current employment, and some of them might have been there for like 30 years. So we ran some really important health programs in sort of upskilling them and getting them healthy and strong and fit, ready to go into their next phase of life. So that was a really rewarding process to be able to help companies like Holden, a huge manufacturing plant out in Elizabeth, and also Coca-Cola as well. So both of those, being a part of that, when I think back, I feel like that was a really important part of my career, and also being able to help them in their careers too.
And what about challenges? Obviously, in pro sport, there's it's high stakes, high pressure at times. What have been some significant challenges you've faced over your career, and what did you sort of learn, or how did you grow from facing those challenges?
I think probably the biggest challenge is juggling that kind of part-time approach to work. I don't think I've ever actually had a full-time job. So it's that really developing your sense of strong boundaries, but also still being flexible with what's needed for the role. So understanding there are times where you are going to work past your hours, but then that'll even out when you get a month off in October. So it is a bit tricky trying to sort of spread yourself out in a way that's going to get the best for the teams you're involved in, but then also not get taken advantage of. So that's on you to manage your time, and that's been a bit of a challenge, as probably early on in my career being a bit of a people pleaser. to now just, having a better understanding of how much better I perform when I'm protecting my time and energy and balance, and then finding that confidence to then be able to set those boundaries. So I think you work through it bit by bit, and obviously there are times when you're better at it than others, but I think that's probably the biggest juggle. And then when I was an athlete, there was that element of it too, like how do I juggle life as an athlete and then life giving both to work? And that's where I sort of had to make that decision that it's time to hang up the boots and just focus on my career a little bit more. It makes that boundary setting a bit easier.
Yeah, well said. We'll move into the topic, Georgia. Thanks for providing context in terms of your career so far and how you started out in the industry, and your passion for it, which is pretty clear. I guess the topic that you've decided to go with for this chat, maybe we'll introduce it with why is it something that you sort of value in terms of what is performance fueling all about, and then both the obsessive and restrictive eating. What's your experience with that? And introduce that topic, I guess, for athletes that perhaps aren't aware of it.
Yeah, I think the first part in terms of like performance nutrition, I've just really seen the value over my career in people that have given that little bit of extra time and priority to making those changes. And I think slowly we're shifting in the sports space to valuing how important nutrition is for recovery and performance, and it's become a real pillar. So it's fantastic to finally see that take such a priority, but with that comes misinformation, people overtaking on social media, or maybe getting paid to sell certain products. So there is a lot of confusion about what actually is performance nutrition. So I guess my passion comes from trying to dispel that confusion. And as I shared, I had that sort of lived experience as a young athlete, where I think I was on my first diet at about 14, and I was playing maybe 4 sports at that time. The worst of it was sort of in my maybe around year 11 or 12. And I was on a really restrictive, low carb diet, self-imposed. And part of, I guess, the issue was that because I wasn't very thin or hadn't lost a lot of weight, it kind of went unnoticed. Whereas I think some of those biases of us just sort of expecting maybe disordered eating to be only in very thin people, it meant that we are sometimes oblivious to some of those red flags that are right in front of us. So getting into uni and learning about food was really helpful for me. But then when I got back into the elite space with sport, it became almost like a re-triggering sort of process, because we had body composition assessments, we're getting skin folds done, weights are public, all those sorts of things that maybe aren't the safest environment for someone who has had that previous experience. So for me, it's sort of led me to want to create environments and create connections with athletes that then I can leave in a positive way, and I'm not feeling like I'm making their situation worse, and hopefully I'm helping to make them be able to fuel themselves really confidently and build that happy relationship with themselves and their body.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got quite an individualised approach with the athletes you work with. Maybe talk us through that. What are some sort of key things you take into account that perhaps a diet doesn't engage compared to working with a professional?
I think probably the biggest thing is that we all like really different foods. So when I see, say, diet protocols or programs, gym challenges that wheel out with meal plans and things like that, I find that they're just very generic. There might be the chicken, broccoli, and rice, or the overnight oats, and it doesn't take into account anything that the athlete actually likes, or the player or the person that's completing it. So for me, one of the big things is actually going through someone's diet with them and seeing where they're at and starting there. I don't like the idea of us overhauling our entire lives all at once, because I just find it's not going to be able to stick. So being able to actually negotiate, work with the athlete, what's realistic, what can we actually do? And I find we get those little wins, and that gets them coming back, because they can see the success straight away, and they aren't feeling overwhelmed. I think that's the biggest thing. Sometimes when we think about sports nutrition, there's so many factors we can improve on, but if we are looking at all of that, we're kind of missing the really obvious, what I call your big rocks. So are you eating regular meals? Have you got some carbs and protein at those meal times? Have you planned ahead? Do you know what you're having at least for tomorrow the night before. So it's just some simple things, and usually it's about tackling those first, and then we can look to refine as we go.
And for those that have perhaps followed a diet before and they had they wanted, it was restrictive. The goal was to lose weight, and they were successful in that. So there's a positive association with that diet. What would be some of the negative setbacks for a high performing athlete when following a restrictive diet that perhaps that maybe they followed at a younger age, like you said, teenagers, they might not be aware of, or from an education piece.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard because we are in a society that information and diet culture is sort of all around us without us really realizing. So back in my day, it was on magazines and in movies and TV shows. These days, it tends to be that more social media side of things. But one of the things that comes up quite frequently is what we call like your low energy availability. So basically, your body's job is to keep you alive. And so it will always fuel that exercise because you're making it move. So it's got to give that energy that you're eating through your diet to the exercise. And then whatever it's left over from what you've eaten for the day, it gives to things like your digestion, your mood management, your menstrual cycle, your concentration. And if we aren't eating enough and we're in that sort of deficit that's quite large, your body will just have to turn things off. It's kind of like a phone on low power mode. It has to make some sacrifices to run properly because you're asking it to do so much day after day. It'll do it for you, it just might not do it very well. So that's where we see with teenage athletes is, for them in particular, it's a growth thing. So, for females, a lot of our bone density is set before the age of about 25. And if we are spending most of that time restricting our total intake, or we're missing out on key nutrients, things like calcium that are going to support that bone health, we might also be preventing us from reaching our potential as the future goes too. So for male athletes, it's also the impacts on their growth hormones and then that growth potential too. So there's lots of things that come under that low energy availability and coined under RED-S, so relative energy deficiency in sport. And we used to know it mainly as a female athlete triad. So that was, your sort of bone injuries and fractures, loss of menstruation, and sort of loss of weight there. But now we know it's a whole different range of symptoms that, can be more mental health related, can be digestive issues, can be heart issues, hormone function. So it can affect males and females. And I think it's something we're starting to see a bit more in sport as we increase that awareness. And even something as simple as you're constantly getting injured, you're not recovering properly, or you're sick all the time. Those really big red flags that could be something that's affecting you.
I like that analogy, the low power mode of the phone. That can bring home, and no doubt athletes listening in, that what happens on the flip side. So perhaps body composition, they feel like they're in a good spot, and it's more about performance. Perhaps like we're just at the end of obviously in season for most athletes at the moment, but there might be some community footballers that are still in pre-season mode with high training loads. So they are feeling a bit fatigued, a bit lethargic. How should they shift their nutrition to help, I guess, cope with the load?
Yeah, I think the thing with your food intake is you are probably going to be tired in pre-season. I think we preface that like it's really hard. I think there's a big difference between general tiredness and fatigue and exhaustion. So that feeling that you can like barely get through the session, that gas, like you've got nothing left in the tank. That's not great. So if you're feeling like that, or even you're getting to a Friday session and you're completely cooked, that's where we want to be increasing that food. So it could be just having a look at more so starting with those carbohydrates in particular. That's going to be your number one fuel source for those training sessions. So your breads, your pastas, your rice, your cereals, your fruit, potato, sweet potato. And they tend to be the foods that are restricted quite a bit when people are going on more of those diets, or the clean eating and less processed food, particularly those cereals, get removed. So it might just be trialing adding those foods back in. It could be making sure that we're sort of eating every 3 hours is generally what I suggest. So that's either a meal or a snack, and working on those carbohydrates. Because most of the time I do find proteins hit pretty well, just because it is a really something that's really promoted in the fitness industry and sports industry. But those carbohydrates tend to be something that is quite restricted, especially like, reducing our sugars and things like that. So those can play a really important part close to training because they're really fast energy for your body. So it might just be working on liberalizing bit by bit. If it's easier for you to move towards like less processed options like dates or juice or fruit, that's fine to start with that. And then it might be bit by bit, you might swap that date for like a LCM bar or Milo bar and see that that works actually quite well because it's got a little less fiber, a bit more faster energy for you. So it's just trialing it bit by bit rather than, like I said before, overhauling everything at once. It might be just one small change. A good example is when I was in the worst of my dieting, playing footy locally, I would have a Quest bar before my game. That's how bad it was. So the change of that was swapping that to sushi. So I'd have a couple of rolls of sushi. That was a small change that I made. And even just from going from 10 grams of carbohydrates pre-game to probably closer to 40 to 50, I felt a lot better. So it might be a small change like that where it's just swapping the one meal time and then you're just seeing how that affects your body and bit by bit, hopefully getting some positive changes.
It's a very popular topic, performance nutrition, I've found. And we've had a few people on Instagram send through some questions for you, Georgia. So first one's Lachlan Stevenson. He's asked, what is the best foods to eat before and after a game, which I thought was quite topical for what we're talking about.
Yeah.
That feeling for performance and recovery that you mentioned.
Yeah, definitely. So we, particularly at the Crows, have actually had a really big focus on carbohydrates for this preseason. We've just done a really big spiel on carbohydrates around game day as well. So the recommendations, it is hard in our team-based sports because there's not a lot of research in AFL specifically, but there's lots in things like soccer. So we can kind of extrapolate that sort of data, but we generally recommend at least about 7 to 8 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates on your game day. So if we're thinking about someone, me, that's about 70 kilos, that might be about 400 grams of carbs. And to put that into perspective, if you have like 4 slices of bread, that might give you about 50 grams of carbs. So your packet of pasta, like a 500 sort of gram packet, that might be 200 to 300 grams there, but that's pretty hard to eat. So it is about trying to start earlier. So we sort of say about 24 hours in advance, we want to be increasing our carbohydrate intake. And usually that means reducing things like our excess fatty foods. So we might choose a lean meat option. So if we're having pasta, a lean mince to go with that with some tomatoes based sauce instead of like a creamy sauce. And then the day of, it might be having something like 7 or 8 wheat bix. Sometimes our boys do, or your raisin toast with some juice, or even like an acai bowl is fantastic if you've not got any added protein powders that aren't batch tested for that. And then again, eating every couple of hours. So sometimes those small frequent meals mean you can get in some larger quantities. So about 3 to 4 hours before the game, we're aiming for sort of half our plate filled with carbohydrates. And depending on your body weight, that might be, probably 1 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates there. Still a bit of protein to keep you full and satisfied and not hungry during the game. And then as you might be leaving for the game, might have a quick jam sandwich, some 2-minute noodles. And then when you get there, just a banana or starting to sip on a Gatorade to top you off. And then recovery wise, it's what you can get in. I know there's many athletes who really don't feel like eating after a game. So liquid calories can be really helpful. Something like a chocolate milk, your Oak 30 pluses, your Rokeby drinks, they're a really great option and something we rotate through quite a bit. I don't know many people who love to have a protein shake after a game. So we try to not have that just from a taste perspective. Most people aren't feeling like that. And then pairing that with some carbohydrates to start refueling as quickly as we can. So it might be some fruit, watermelon, pineapple is great for the rehydration as well. And then sort of within probably a couple of hours, sit down to a nice balanced meal. So, if you're out for dinner, it could be a roast or a steak with some veggies and a couple of roast potatoes. At home, it might be a burrito bowl or a homemade pizza. Something like that will do the trick with your carbs and proteins and a little bit of color to help with that sort of recovery process from antioxidants and your vitamins and minerals.
Fantastic. What an answer. There you go, Locke. Hopefully you've taken some notes there. Thank you for the question. Thanks, Georgia, for such a thorough answer. And it sounds like, yet again, it's quite individualized and it's something that you take into account, I guess, from sustainability point of view on what the athlete feel like, what do they have an appetite for post-game. Yeah. The Aidan Sanders has written in terms of calories, which is probably something we haven't discussed, but quite fitting from a restrictive sort of point of view. how many calories should be eaten for a footballer per day. It was their question.
Yeah, and that in itself is
Hey, Judah.
hello. I don't know what happened there.
Yeah.
We're finally back.
All good. All good. All good.
We need some calorie.
Yeah. Yep. I'm just noting down the time so I know when to edit it out.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So calorie. I think Aiden Sanders. Yeah. So calories
Yeah.
per day. Yeah. So I guess what's your stance with calories? Should footballers be counting calories? It's quite a topical one in terms of calories. From an education piece? I guess when you're working with younger, developing as well as mature age athletes, is it something that you discuss with them? Is it something they're tracking, or is it more I guess like you talked about 4 grams of carbohydrates and protein.
Yeah. We don't have many athletes that do track things like macros or calories. It's certainly an option. A lot of the time, it's about probably checking in with if it's realistic for them. So it can be quite tiresome, a lot of energy put into monitoring things like that. So there are some athletes that thrive on that sort of data and work really well from it. And if anything, I find it quite educational just from a perspective. So it might be like, hey, let's jump on an app and just put it in for a week and actually just see where you're at. And then we can compare it to where I'd like you to be. So I tend not to talk as much in calories as I do in, like you said, sort of those grams of carbohydrates or grams of protein. Instead, we're working with suggestive portions. So it might be like 2 cups of pastas their portion and working on that 3 times a day. So the portioning thing I find a lot easier. From a total calorie perspective, again, it's very individual. We might have athletes that their basal metabolic rate, so if they're just laid in bed all day, is around 2,000 calories. I'd say that's probably the average of the group. And so you can imagine then if you actually add activity onto that, it's a lot of food. So in pre-season, that might be 3,000 or 4,000 calories as sort of your baseline. So it can vary quite a bit. And obviously the training days versus days off can be quite different as well. So it really is very varying in what you have. And of course, you've got your female athletes that are going to be much smaller. So then they're going to burn fewer calories in comparison. But I would say even then, most of them need at least in the mid sort of 2000s as their sort of baseline intake, especially because a lot of them are working as well. So they have that expenditure with having to manage their output at work too.
And then last one, Kobe Porter's asked, I'm currently 63 to 65 kilos and struggle to put on weight. I would like to know how to increase my weight for muscle development.
Yeah. So that's one we work with a lot with our, 1st to 3 year athletes coming through, is getting some mass onto them. And I find it is hard. It is probably harder putting on weight than any athlete who's ever had to sort of cut weight. It's a full-time job eating enough if you're a hard gainer. So, in that instance, it's really about being organized and planning ahead. So a lot of the times I see with athletes that are struggling to gain weight is that they aren't planning ahead with their food options. So then they're caught out and then they might skip that snack or that meal time. So that might be 300 calories, for example, for a snack that we worked out for them. And then over the course of a week, if that happens every week, that ends up being sort of almost a day's intake worth of calories. So it's really important to be organized and as structured as you can be. And again, it might just be more small, frequent meals, and then making sure every time you're eating, it's something that's got a high carbohydrate, fat, or protein source in it. So if you're sitting down to, say, your typical sort of steak, veggies, potato meal, your steak might have some gravy on it. You might put some extra olive oil, so higher calorie source of fat on your veggies. And then you might, have a bit of parmesan over your potatoes. So those small changes might add an extra 200 calories to your meal, which means you don't have to go and eat an extra snack. So it's using those kind of sneaky additions and high energy foods. It could be swapping from potatoes to swapping to pasta. So potatoes are really satiating, so they keep us really full, which is probably not what you want when you want to be trying to eat a lot of food. So for the same volume, you can almost get double the carbohydrates from having something like your pasta, or like your couscous can be a good option as well. So those kind of small shifts can add up across the day. And then little things like swapping skim milk to full cream, your skim yogurts to full cream. Again, a couple of extra 100 calories here and there. It really does make a big difference. So yeah, be organized, swap to high energy options, and kind of cut back on those really high volume foods, i.e. foods that, will fill us up but aren't really giving us many calories.
Yeah. And on the flip side, for athletes listening in that do want to reduce their body fat or weight for their football performance, but they're mindful of not restricting themselves from a health point of view, like you mentioned, what's some of your favourite strategies to put in place for someone with that goal in mind?
Yeah, and I think this is a really hard point when I do sit and practice in the way that I do, sort of with that non-diet lens, is that the sporting world does have this position around body composition and, sort of maybe wanting us to all be in very similar blocks, whereas I find people genetically might just not ever be as lean as we maybe want them to be. So that can be really challenging, especially if you are that athlete and you've spent your entire career trying to lose weight. But I like the ethos of our body will sit where it wants to sit when we are, fueling it correctly, getting enough sleep and recovery, managing our stress, getting enough social connection, and getting the right amount of training. And so most of the time, most of us can work on one of these, and it could just be picking up that area and seeing that flow-on effect. From a nutrition standpoint, more often than not, I actually see athletes that are trying to lose weight being way too restrictive. So they're cutting a lot of food out, and then that leads to post-game eating quite a lot of food in sort of that binge restrict model. So they're eating past comfortable fullness, making themselves feel sick, and that cycle continues. So it might actually be around, can we fuel and support training a little bit better, add some more things like your complex carbohydrates, like your rice, your potatoes, and pastas back in. So you're feeling good, you're feeling fueled and not so deprived. There's an element of, if we're taking out things and eliminating them, our brain will just want them more. So it's like, I know so many athletes that I can't have a block of chocolate in the cupboard. And I used to be like that, I'd eat it all at once. But now I can go and have a square and it's, and move on. So it's about trying to actually help athletes get to that place. So if that's you, it might be, okay, have you actually had your 3 meals and 2 snacks across the day as a minimum? Because I guarantee if you miss one of those meals or you've removed carbohydrates, you will end up in the freezer or the cupboard after dinner looking for that something extra and something sweet. And then not depriving yourself. So instead of having nothing during the week, it might be having like something sort of like mini magnum or a small portioned sort of sweet option to help meet that craving, but not feel too out of control with it. So I find sometimes those strategies help to create that better relationship with food, which in turn flows on to a body composition that they feel better in as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you, Georgia. What were the 5 areas there? Social connection.
So your social connection, sort of like your stress management, your recovery and your sleep, obviously your food. I've forgotten one more. I feel like I may have just grouped a couple.
Recovery.
Yeah. Your training,
obviously
getting your training right.
Training. Yeah. On the training, so I guess periodizing your nutrition for someone that for footballers at the moment that you're working with that are in season, they've got that sort of like 2 sessions a week, typically with one lower day, bit of still in that recovery mode, and then their main training to gear them up for their game day. How does your sort of nutrition shift, whether you are running on that day compared to maybe a lighter day? And what are some strategies to put in place to ensure that you're ticking that box from a recovery point of view, but also, like you said, the preparation shouldn't just be on the day of nutrition. It can be 24 hours before. So starting to focus on fueling that for that upcoming game and thinking about game time and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think one of the things I see quite commonly in season is athletes losing things like muscle mass because, again, they sort of underestimate how much they do still burn even on the lower days. So, for example, on some of our, say, like a flash run day, they might come in and do some extra hands or skills or half an hour of craft, and then they go out for their flash run, and that might, what is meant to be, say, 20 minutes ends up being like an hour because they're having some kicks on goal or they're working on some other skills. And then they come in, they have some lunch, and then they're more skills, more gym, and that's meant to be their lower day. So we've still got quite a lot of movement, and I think sometimes we don't account for that. And even on those off days, it might be like going and playing golf, for example, and that's 4 or 5 hours of movement. So it is, I think sometimes how much we burn in pre-season, so that really, really high expenditure, which is almost too hard to reach, warps our view of then the in-season model. So it's about reminding athletes they still do use quite a lot of fuel. You still may be exercising 3 or 4 hours a day, which is way more than the average person. So we still need to have a baseline. So I like to work on, this is your baseline, and then we add. So our baseline is 3 meals, probably 1 to 2 snacks. And then on training days, we add a pre-training snack, post-training snack around each session. And then game day, that frequency probably still continues, but we're making it more around carbohydrates. So we're never taking away, we're adding. So we always have that structure there and that skeleton. And I find that model helps particularly on their lower days, the day post game, where I find athletes might have a brunch with each other, but then they're not eating till 11 o'clock. So they've missed a meal time, and then they don't eat lunch till 2 or 3, and then they have dinner, and then they're going to bed. So it might be more, okay, we wake up, we still have a small breakfast, we still have brunch, we have a lunch like we usually would, and then we're still having our dinner and maybe a supper. So it's just shifting it still and having that structure, but also then being able to add and build towards that game day with extra carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so critical. It's such a great point to make that, it's a long season. So if you're losing that lean muscle mass and your team's going to be playing finals where you're probably the most important time to have it to be your strongest come September, can definitely get you caught out. So be proactive. It's some great advice there. Thanks, Georgia. What about common myths and misconceptions? I think it was off air we were talking about some of them, and no doubt they can be frustrating. What are some common ones that I guess you've had to educate developing footballers on, to ensure that they are getting that peak performance and looking after their health?
I think the number one is that sugar is the devil. A lot of them come in and, maybe they've seen the I Quit Sugar film or whatever it was in school, and they're still really apprehensive about like a full sugar Gatorade at training or having lollies. So, we educate a lot on the role that those foods actually play as a sports nutrition tool. So we see it as a way to improve performance and utilizing it. In that sense, it's fast fuel. It's going to be really easy to digest and for your body to access. So you can maintain your performance in training and games. So there is an element where that sugar is really important, and it's what our body is going to break down and use quickly. But if we try and only rely on our whole foods, so only potato and only fruit, we're going to be really full from all the fiber we're going to eat, and we're not going to be able to hit those total carbohydrate amounts. So it's about educating that we need a mix of both. Probably 80% of our diet is going to be those really wholesome foods that provide us lots of other nutrients. And then that sort of 20 to 30% might need to be more of those higher, more processed foods. And that could shift on a game day. That might be like 60-40 in the other direction. And then on a recovery day, it might be the other way, like a 90-10 approach. So it's about utilizing those foods and then them seeing the benefits as well. Probably the other one is fasting, which is really tricky with athletes. Obviously, for the male population, they're starting their training earlier. So if they're fasting in the morning, they're not eating before they're coming to training. So their body, if it doesn't have those carbohydrates, its next best option for fuel is probably going to be their muscles, and using those for a fuel source to get them through. And then for our female athletes, most of the research just isn't there for females to be fasting to begin with. It just doesn't seem to work with how our hormones, utilize fuel and like to sort of have those more regular bouts of food coming through. So fasting in particular, I just don't really think is a good strategy for most athletes, especially with how much they do, and then how small the window is to then try and fit everything in and around training and those recovery periods as well.
And what about hydration for athletes that are listening and try and get the balance right between staying well hydrated for that performance mindset, but then also maybe they've experienced where they've overhydrated and they feel that's affected them, whether they have to go to the toilet regularly throughout the game or they just feel tired from over drinking water. What's sort of your tips on trying to find that balance?
Yeah, I actually had a really good example of this season where we had quite a senior player who thought that maybe he was overhydrating, had we call it sort of clear urine. So if it's clear, you're probably going to the toilet too much. We do want that kind of like straw color, and was waking up multiple times during the night. And then, still, even though he was hydrating, just felt like he was dehydrated because he was probably flushing out some of his electrolytes. So we went more on a bit more of a structure with his game day plan, and added in things like electrolyte tablets the day before and like your no sugar options to help with added sort of sodium and potassium to hold on to that water, and then timing it around meals as well. That can sometimes help if you're eating those carbohydrates, they hold on to water too, so they can cellularly sort of hydrate you as well. And then it's just that volume. So it might be that, instead of 6 liters, you're stripping it back to 5 and seeing how that feels, and then maybe back to 4 if that's more realistic. The great thing about AFO is that we have breaks to drink, and there are people who run out and give you sips of water and things like that. So you're never going to be without fluids in that sense. So it might just be, an extra sort of litre or a litre and a half for that person on top of their normal baseline intake. But yeah, that sort of urine colour, and then also your thirst. So thirst is a great measure. If you're thirsty, you need a drink. If you're not actually feeling thirsty at all, you're probably very well hydrated.
Awesome. That's some good practical advice there. And what about caffeine? What's your stance on caffeine for those that maybe are interested in trialling it out? They're in practice match mode at the moment. They've heard some benefits from it. What are some things to be mindful of? And what's the best sort of way to manage caffeine for game day, I guess?
I definitely recommend trialing it. That would be my number one suggestion. So caffeine is a fantastic tool for us to improve performance. It increases concentration, reduces time to fatigue. But for some people, it can be a little bit too much. So especially if you don't have any daily caffeine intake, if you're a coffee drinker or a tea drinker, just suddenly then overwhelm your body with 100, 200 milligrams of caffeine through a pre-workout or a gel might be quite a lot. So I'd recommend practicing around training. And obviously with more of our local leagues, if you're training at night, that might be the sacrifice of that one night's sleep, but it will support you for game day, having known how you felt. So with our caffeine options, there are so many on the market now. So it could be pre-workout, like I mentioned. And most of them I've found, particularly if you've got your batch tested supplements, like say your True Workout, your BSC, they have now got smaller portions too. I found, a few years ago, they had sort of 200, 300 milligram portions of those options. That just seemed to be too much for most people. So our idea with caffeine is trying to get the lowest possible dose with the best possible outcome. So it's not a more is better approach. So if we can try and start with a lower amount, so again, maybe just a coffee around training about 30 minutes before you're about to kick off, or your caffeine gel or caffeine gum, all of those have around 100 milligrams. So starting low, and then it might be next time you try doubling that and seeing how you feel each time. And then as the game goes on, I find there's a lot of athletes that will reach for caffeine gel at 3/4 time, and there's no point by then. It's going to kick in by the end of the game, and then you're just going to be wired for the rest of the night. So instead, probably the quarter break and the half times when you might be increasing that dosing and getting that top up. But after half time, there's probably no point getting it in.
Yeah. Thanks again. And what about on that supplements? I guess what's some of your go-tos? What are some things that footballers should be aware to perhaps avoid or just be aware of when bringing supplements into their nutrition?
I think probably the main one is, you want to make sure it's batch tested. So a lot of the leagues, regardless of level, are getting drug tested now. So you want to make sure you're taking something that's safe. Even if you're not getting drug tested, you want to make sure that you know what's actually in the product. So working with those trusted brands and making sure you've got that sort of certificate. So those people have then, what they've done is they've gotten that third party tested to say that, there's low risk that there's contamination within that product. So starting with that, and then not everyone needs to be on supplements. I think that's the main thing. They're sort of what we call like the sprinkles on the top of the cake. There's no point just starting with supplements if you don't eat regularly or you're not getting that timing right. You're probably not going to get the benefit. It's a 1 to 3% increase, where getting your food right might be like a 20% increase. So with your supplements, the most common ones that we sort of use that are really have a strong evidence base are things like your creatine. So that's going to help with your muscle mass growth and your strength and performance. And also with your more shorter duration, so really high intensity kind of work, it's going to help with improving that. Same with your beta alanine as well. We also use things like your nitrates, so your beetroot juice, which helps to increase your oxygen delivery around your body, so it increases the size of your blood vessels. So in theory, you're probably going to have be able to go a bit harder for a bit longer. So there's a few different things you can use on your game day, but also every day. And then as we get into the winter months, things like your vitamins and minerals can be quite handy. So early signs of cold and flu, like your runny nose or a scratchy throat, taking some high dose vitamin C or zinc, if you get that early enough, can actually reduce the severity of your cold and flu, taking that for like your week. And then you're back on the park earlier. So some people might just habitually just take some extra multivitamins over that winter period if they've particularly run down. But I find just saving it and having that high dose can be just as effective, especially if you know that colds and flus are sort of going around at that time period. And then obviously your protein. Your protein powder is a great option for convenience, for fortifying food. So I use it a lot to, say, add more protein to a yogurt or to an oat bowl or to some bliss balls or to a smoothie. Rather than just having it purely as a shake, you can start to use it in ways that actually just fortify what you're already eating.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, a whole list of practical advice there, some great analogies as well, for people to get a better understanding of performance nutrition and the risks of restricted eating. Is there anything that we haven't touched on? You've also mentioned a couple of stories or more stories that sort of spring front of mind. Anything that you want to sort of add to the topic, Georgia, before we start to wrap it up?
I think I've covered all I thought. Yep.
Yeah. What about moving back to your sort of work? Any pet peeves or work life things that sort of fire you up?
I think probably my biggest pet peeve is like if we are sort of providing, your food for your athletes and things, is them leaving stuff out. So I find sometimes you sort of, as the person providing the food, you're also cleaning up after them or reminding them to actually put your stuff away. I feel like I have the same conversation with my husband at home as I have with the boys at the club, like close the cupboard door when we put the things away. So it's a bit of fun and a bit of we have a bit of a joke with each other about leaving stuff out, and then there'll be times where I come in and it's absolutely spotless. So I think they just try to rile me up, knowing that it gets a reaction out of me. So they're definitely better for it, though. They're very good at stacking dishwashers now because we've done a bit of training on how to do that effectively.
Wow, that's impressive. Very
Yeah.
impressive. Well done. And what about favourite way to spend a day off?
Well, sport, there's not heaps of days off, especially in a row. So I like to start at the same every morning. We go for a walk, get a coffee and walk the dogs, my husband. And then it's just the freedom to do whatever I like. So it could be, going to the gym, going down south. We have really nice coastal beaches here in SA, going for a surf or to a winery, or just having sort of like homemade pizzas and cruising and watching some Netflix for the night. So I really just like to chill out. My favorite thing to do is have a nap. So if I can tee up an afternoon where I get just 30 minutes to get some sleep back, I've managed to nail that. And that's one of my all-time things to look forward to on a day off.
Oh, very good. Yeah, recharge the batteries. It's so important.
Yeah.
Like you said, a busy schedule. What about what's on the horizon for 2024? Probably something we haven't talked about is your role. Like you said, you recently retired from football, juggling both playing and working with athletes, and you're now sole focused in working with the AFL men's and AFLW athletes. How do you find working between the two programs, and what are you most excited about for the rest of the year? Obviously, this recording's mid-March of 2024.
I think, yeah, like you said, it's the first year in probably about 12 years that I won't have footy in winter. So I don't know what I'll do with myself having sometimes my weekends free completely. We've got a few Thursday and Friday night games with the Crows this year, which is really exciting. So, I mean, for the men's program, it's 100% getting back to finals. That's what, we're pushing to do this year. And I think we're really set up to do well. So I love going to Adelaide Oval, absorbing all the atmosphere and watching the boys just go to work. They really thrive in those situations. So I'm looking forward to that. And for our women's program, I'd love to see them get another premiership. And I think they're still around the mark over the last sort of 7-8 seasons. So they're definitely back there again. They're already back training and working really hard. So no doubt they're going to be in the finals mix again this season. And then I just started some work with the Thunderbirds as well in January. So hopefully supporting them going back to back after they won the premiership last year, and just working with a whole nother group of athletes who have different requirements, different lifestyles. So it's another challenge and another string to the bow.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it's probably springing the last couple of questions in terms of some unique challenges there, both changing codes, but also going from your teammates to now you're supporting them from a sort of a coach athlete sort of different perspective. How have you found that transition for those that you were playing with to now working with them and helping them with their nutrition with the AFLW athletes? And then on the flip side, changing codes. What are some of your tips for practitioners that may have never worked in a sport before and moving codes?
Yeah, I think the transition was pretty seamless from athlete to then working with the girls. So I did that probably in 20, I think it was about 2019, 20, was doing the girls program solely before I went to the Suns and then came back. So that felt like a pretty seamless sort of approach. And it's nice to have that connection with the girls. It's almost nicer retiring because it got a bit awkward playing against some of the girls when they went back to Sample being their dietitian. So it's nicer to not have to play against them each weekend and see, competitive version of me. And then,
Yeah.
Switching codes, I think I played netball growing up, but the style of netball I played at like 14 is very different to the elite standard. And they are just incredible athletes. So, switching codes is all about really understanding the sport. So I've made a big effort to go to as many training sessions as I can, even though it might not be in my contract or time to do that. Sort of giving myself that time to better understand their output and what is actually required means I can better understand how much fuel that they need. So yeah, going to games, going to trainings, immersing yourself as much as possible. I think doing that has meant that I've managed to also move quite seamlessly in with them and, learning and listening. I think that listening, because you are a fresh set of eyes if you're new to a team, those athletes probably have some things that they want to improve on, whether it might be as a program as a whole or individually. And sometimes when it's a fresh person, they can have the opportunity to offload, give suggestions, give feedback, and then you can fix problems quite quickly that maybe were a bit stumbling block before, just so they didn't feel like they could speak up, or they finally had the opportunity to give some feedback. So that's been helpful to do that. So sort of solving problems, but then actually just making sure I understand what's going on and how the sport works.
Fantastic. Yeah, some great advice for either some future dietitians there or those currently working and perhaps shifting codes. I appreciate that. For the footballers listening in that perhaps want to work with you privately, Georgia, is there an opportunity there with private consulting, or are you too busy with the 3 different programs you're involved in at elite level?
I'm pretty busy, but I still have a small amount of time for more virtual clients. I see clients on Zoom, and particularly your sort of sports, more specific, and also people working on their relationship with their food and their body. So that's something I'm really passionate about. So both of those I do have a small amount of time for, and with as long as people are flexible with their schedule and my schedule, we tend to make it work.
Oh, there you go. For those that are interested, or perhaps those that want to connect with you on social media and have a follow-up question that have listened to the podcast, where's the best place to get in contact?
Yeah, so I have Instagram Eclipse Fuel. So that's where I post all of my sporting and nutrition related stuff. I try to not bombard my regular followers with all that information. So yeah, I speak a lot about how to fuel properly, sort of some niche topics around that disordered eating space as well. And yeah, there's I think I've got a couple of thousand posts on there. So a lot of information ready to go to just kind of spend some time scrolling through straight away. Or I'm always sort of looking through my DMs at any messages and get back to people pretty quickly. So
Perfect. Well, thanks for that, Georgia. I'll make sure to add the link in the show notes for those that might be listening and driving. Don't sweat. I'll make sure that link is in the show notes, so when you do park the car, you can easily access there and send a DM to Georgia. But yeah, thank you again for tuning in. That was a fantastic chat. Like I said, nutrition is a really popular topic, and I really appreciate you answering my questions for the listeners, but also thank you for all the listeners that also sent in some questions for Georgia. That was really topical and well thought, so it's good to get that perspective from the athlete. So yeah, thanks, Georgia. Thank you for jumping on. And thank you for everyone that's tuned in live. If you tuned in halfway through, make sure to listen to the very start to hear Georgia's journey in performance dietitian, as well as her playing career. So you can find this episode on our YouTube channel before we release it on a podcast in the next few weeks. Our next live interview is with Gareth Sanford at 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. That'll be on the 11th of April. So I look forward to seeing you guys then. Thanks again, Georgia.